I'm going to be talking about power in the food system. And as Kathy mentioned, I write books about food politics. And the unstated, usually unstated, sometimes stated explicitly, message of these books, or the question that they ask, is who controls the food system? And what can we do to change the way the control in the food system works so that those of us who are interested in public health and social policy can have some real control over it. Now, I'm talked about changing the food system. Food system is the new buzzword for talking about everything having to do with food these days. It's a relatively new public concept, one that's widely accepted, and everybody is talking about it. And by food system, usually everybody else means, and I mean too, everything that happens to food between the time it's produced, transported, stored, sold, consumed, wasted. The entire picture of food production and consumption. And the underlying theory behind the idea of food systems is that you can't talk about food consumption without also talking about the way that food is produced, and that necessarily gets you into politics. You can't stay out of it. I'm a public health person, and when I think of the food system, I think of the three most important global public health problems that are affected by the food system, and these are food insecurity, meaning hunger and malnutrition, its consequences. There are about 1 billion people in the world who don't have enough to eat, and we need to keep them in mind all the time while talking about the second problem, which has to do with eating so much that you gain weight, become obese, develop greater risk for type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and other non-communicable diseases. And that affects about 2 billion people in the world. Enormous problem. And then the third is the effect of our food production and consumption system on the environment and on climate change, a problem that affects absolutely everybody and that is becoming increasingly important. All three of these problems are the result of dysfunctional food systems in one way or another, which is why the food system approach for talking about them is so useful. Now, my simple and the lots of other people's way of looking at the food system problems is the reason for the dysfunction is that the food system is designed for profit. It's not designed for public health, the environment, or any kind of social equity. And lots of people have written very excellent books about these things, and I think make a very strong case for it. So when I'm talking about the food system and talking about where the profits are, the usual terms that are being used to describe them are big food and big agriculture. Big food is described in this really quite wonderful graphic where the handful of companies who control most of the food products that are sold in supermarkets globally are shown by the number of products that each of them owns, and it's really only a few companies that control this and have power over what's in our supermarkets. The same kind of graphic has been done for, in this case, the seed industry structure. This is big agriculture. And there are 4 major companies that own almost all of the seeds that are used to produce our corn and soybeans and other major crops. Obviously, if only a few companies control this, they control a lot and have power over the food system. And in fact, Philip Howard has written a book called Concentration and Power in the Food System. And what I find interesting about that is that it is an easy explanation for why beef prices are the same everywhere. And there are people who are suing some of these larger companies for price fixing. There are so few companies involved in meat production, seed production, and some of these other things that they control prices, they control what the food supply looks like. What I find fascinating about this is that when we look at food consumption, the food industry and its power is completely missing. Where is it? If I go online and ask for a graphic that gives influences on obesity, influences on food choices, I get graphics like this one, in which they talk about lifestyle and cost and religious and moral beliefs and food trends and whether you can cook or not and what's available. Nothing on this suggests anything about how food companies or the food industry might influence people's choices, as if it just doesn't exist. It's just not there. And I find that fascinating because from what I know about the way advertising works is you're not supposed to notice it. If advertising is done well, it slips below the radar of critical thinking. You don't notice it. It's just part of the landscape. It's completely normal. And that's what I think we're seeing here. And so what I've tried to do in my own work is to refocus the discussion and just get people to pay attention to what the food industry is doing, sometimes visibly, sometimes invisibly, to try to get us to buy its products, which is, after all, what they're in business to do. So in refocusing the discussion, I want us all to think about, just for a minute, about how food companies are not social service agencies, they're not public health agencies. To think that they are is not to understand the situation, because they're businesses, and like all businesses, their primary responsibility is to their stockholders and to make profits. And in the case of the food industry, because food is so hugely overproduced, in the United States, we have twice the number of calories available per person per day as the population needs as a whole. This makes the food industry hugely competitive because they have to sell their products in an environment in which there's so much food available. It's just enormously competitive. And it's not just that they have to make a profit. They have to grow their profits, because early in the 1980s, we had in the United States a movement called the shareholder value movement, which was a movement of stockholders, people who own stock in publicly traded corporations, which said that the business about blue chip stocks, long, slow return on investment, we don't want that. We want higher immediate returns on investment. And they really changed the way that Wall Street evaluated corporations. So corporations not only have to make a profit, they have to grow their profits. This is very difficult to do if you're in a competitive environment with small profit margins. And so we see that, and I have a lot of sympathy for food companies. They're under enormous pressure. They're under pressure from advocates like me who are always complaining about what they're doing, from regulators who want to regulate them, from lawyers who are dying to sue them, from Wall Street that simply wants them to make more money every 90 days. And food companies have reacted to this by going through all the stages of death and denial. They started out by doing nothing and ignoring it, then denying that they had any responsibility for people's health or people's purchases. Then they began changing their products or appearing to change their products, and then they began fighting back. And it's the fighting back that I want to say a little bit about, because they fight back in ways that are visible and invisible. And in general, what the food industry has done is to adopt intact what is referred to as the tobacco industry playbook. The tobacco industry, when research began coming out linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer, the tobacco companies got together and said, how are we going to deal with this? And they developed a public relations strategy that involved a series of steps that were to be taken simultaneously. The first is to cast doubt on any research that shows that your product is harmful. And they were the cigarette industry was masterful at doing that. and that delayed regulation of cigarettes for decades. The second strategy was to blame everything on personal responsibility. It's not our fault if you buy our food. We're not holding a gun to your head forcing you to buy our product. It's up to you. It's your responsibility. If you eat badly and become ill, it's your problem. It's not ours. Another is to say, don't regulate us. We'll take care of our own regulation. Then they fund research to give them the kind of research results that they want, and that's really what I talked about in my last book, and I'll talk about in a little bit. They fund front groups. They get involved in public policy. They partner with government. Great Britain is having a great deal of difficulty right now with partnerships with industry over food policy. And then if none of that works, they're lobbying behind the scene and doing a lot of litigating, and I'll give you some examples of this. So my most recent book, Unsavory Truth, is about how the food industry influences research, the production and outcome of the ways in which nutrition societies make statements about diet and health, the way they influence advisory committees, and we're seeing that in the United States on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, which met this week, right now, and the way they affect public policy. The other book is the adorable Portuguese translation of Unsavory Truth. I think it's really cute. It's printed on pink paper. It's adorable. So I had three reasons for writing this book. The first was something I've been sort of fretting about for a long time. I wrote my first article about industry funding of research societies and advice in 2001. I incorporated that article as a chapter in my book, Food Politics, which came out in 2002, and then I kind of forgot about it. And when I was doing the research for Soda Politics, which came out in 2015, I started running across studies that Coca-Cola had funded and was reminded of all of this, began writing about it again, and wrote about it in Soda Politics. A second reason had to do with the Soda Politics research, was while I was noticing Coca-Cola's funding of research, I started noticing other companies' funding of research. And in March 2015, I began this exercise of every time I ran across 5 industry-funded studies, I would post summaries on my website. And I did this for a whole year. Compulsively. And at the end of the year, I had 168 studies posted, and of those, 156 had results that were favorable to the interests of whoever the sponsor was. I could only find 12 that were unfavorable, even though I begged readers to send me examples. Now, this was, for those of you who are scientists, this was a convenient sample. It was just what I ran across as I happened to be reading, and very unsystematically done. So the only scientific conclusion I could draw from this was that it's easier to find industry-funded studies with results favorable to the sponsor's interest than it is to find results that are unfavorable. But in fact, this is a very widely accepted conclusion, as I'll show you. But I did get some interesting information out of this, and one piece of that information was the extraordinary number of sponsors of research to demonstrate that their products were healthy, certainly weren't unhealthy, and that any information to the contrary was so badly done that you didn't have to pay attention to it. Every product that you can think of. If it's a healthy product, they want to prove it's a superfood. If it's an unhealthy product, they want to prove it's okay. Every company that you can think of, every trade association is funding research. And I'll give you just one example of it. It's so easy to spot industry-funded studies that I can tell them from their titles. Here, for example, is a study. I love mangoes. Here's for a study that shows that mangoes are better for constipation than fiber supplements. I looked at the title of this study and I thought, who paid for this? Bingo, the National Mango Board. Really, really easy to tell these, because who else would do this kind of research? It's silly on its face. But this is a way that they can, I guess they're not selling enough mangoes. This is a way they can sell more mangoes, I guess, or any of those other products. And then the thing that really made me do Unsavory Truth was this article that came out in the New York Times in 2015 about how Coca-Cola had funded a group of researchers at major universities in the United States, mainly to produce research that would show that exercise is more important than what you eat in weight gain, something that is unfortunately false. I'm sad to say that it's very hard to work off calories. And I was quoted in the article quite rudely, and I said something quite rude about it, and I got called by a lot of reporters asking for comments on it, and the reporters were shocked. They were shocked that Coca-Cola would fund research like this. They were shocked that university researchers would take money from Coca-Cola for doing this kind of research, and they were shocked that the universities would allow it. And I thought, if reporters, hard-boiled American reporters, don't understand how this system works, I have another book to write. And so I did. Now, this article had a lot of consequences. For one thing, Coca-Cola was very embarrassed about it and said it would change its practices, and they would post on their website in the United States a list of everybody they funded and how much they paid them. And they have done that, and they have kept up with it. And the most recent posting was that between 2010 and 2018, Coca-Cola spent $147 million in the United States on partnerships and research. I met with a member of parliament earlier this week, and his staff said that you don't have a Coca-Cola transparency website in the UK. You should ask Coca-Cola to do that. They will. In any case, transparency has consequences, and because the website had this information on it, researchers were able to use that information to do an analysis and publish an analysis asking the question, do sugar-sweetened beverages cause obesity and diabetes? They should have said, are sugar-sweetened beverages associated with obesity and diabetes, but that's okay, you get the idea. They found 60 studies. Of those studies, 26 said no. Sugar-sweetened beverages have nothing to do with obesity and diabetes, and 25 of those were funded by the sugar-sweetened beverage industry. On the other hand, they found 34 studies that said, yes, indeed, we find an association between sugar-sweetened beverages, obesity, and diabetes, and only one of those was industry funded, and I'm willing to bet that that person never got industry funding again. Now, this is an example of what is very well known from other products, in particular the cigarette industry, the chemical industry, and the pharmaceutical drug industry is the easiest one to talk about because so much of what has happened with pharmaceutical drugs is public, at least in the United States. Looking at the effects of industry funding on physicians, decisions about prescribing, decisions on advisory committees and so forth, has been the subject of 50 years of research. So there's an enormous decades of research going back, libraries full of books, libraries full of journal articles, and the conclusions of these can be summarized on one side. Sponsored research favors the sponsor's interest, big surprise. Gifts work. Larger gifts have a bigger influence than smaller gifts, but even a pen and a prescription pad with a drug logo on it is enough to be associated with physicians' changes in prescription practices. What makes this so difficult to talk about and to study is that the influence of the gifts and the funding is largely unconscious, it's unintentional, and it's unrecognized by the recipients. They didn't intend to be influenced. They deny that they're influenced. They just don't see it. The justifications for taking industry money are largely invalid. The only reasonable justification is the money, and we can argue about whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. And that disclosure of funding is necessary, but it's not really sufficient to prevent the influence. Now, when I was doing the research for Unsavory Truth, I could find precisely 11 studies in contrast to the literally thousands that have been done on drug industry funding. I could find only 11. These were published between 2003 and 2018. There have been 2 more that have come out since. And they vary a lot in the way they were conducted and what was studied, but in general they come out with the same conclusion, that industry-funded studies favor the sponsor's interest. By this time, this should be a given and just sort of understood. The question is what to do about it. Well, another question is, how does it happen? And this too has been researched by Lisa Biro and her colleagues at the University of Sydney. And they've done a study of where does industry influence occur in the research process. It could occur in the way the question is asked, in the design, in the methods, in the conduct, in the reporting. And their research shows that in general, the bias shows up most in the way the research question is asked. And this is really easy to understand. I get letters all the time from trade association for grapes, pomegranates, yogurt, anything that you can think of, saying, we have $50,000 and we're looking for proposals that will demonstrate the benefits of our products for cholesterol reduction, cognitive function. I mean, they're very specific about what they want to show benefits in. There's a big difference between designing a study to show benefits and designing a study that's open-ended to find out what a product will actually do. And this may sound like a subtle distinction, but I can tell you it's really easy to design a study to show benefits because you just pick the people you're going to study carefully to show that they're going to benefit from it. You don't pick people that are not going to benefit from it. It's really easy to do. So that's been shown. And it should be obvious by now that I have a point of view on this. And I have to say that not everyone shares my point of view. I think it's fair to say, and in fact there's a huge debate in the nutrition and public health literature about whether industry funding is good, bad, or indifferent, with people who on the one hand argue that industry partnerships will derail public health nutrition, and other people saying we should welcome industry's involvement because if industry isn't involved, the system won't change. And you can pick where you are on that continuum. Nutrition research is under a lot of attack right now. It's under attack not only from people like me who are concerned about industry funding, but it's also under attack for people who think that nutritional epidemiology is not very scientifically rigorous. And that disclosures in nutrition research are especially important. It's not enough to disclose industry funding. It's also important to disclose your advocacy or activist work. This is a direct quote from a paper from a guy at Stanford, somebody at Stanford who's a statistician. This paper says that if you're a vegan, you follow the Atkins diet or gluten-free, or you're arguing in favor of animal protein or taking supplements of one kind or another, you should disclose this in your papers. So I think it's only fair that I give you my disclosure statement. This is my standard disclosure. Actually, it's a little old because I'm now retired from New York University officially. This is what retirement looks like. And so my salary or my retirement benefits from New York University support everything I do and my website, and I get royalties from books and honoraria and travel, thank you very much, from things about matters that I'm writing about. I'm an omnivore, and I thought you should see how this thesaurus plus defines omnivore because it works for this symposium. Eater, consumer, glutton, gourmet, diner, epicure, devourer, gorger, bon vivant, gastronomer. I love them. I love them. Now, for those of you who heard Joanna Blythman's talk last night, some of this will be quite familiar, although discussed in a slightly different way, I think. If we're going to talk about power in the food system, it seems to me that we want power in the food system in order to prevent food insecurity, to promote nutritional health and prevent obesity and related chronic diseases, and to protect the environment. And the question is, how do we go about doing that? And the report that Joanna talked about last night, the Eat Lancet report, was one of two reports that the Lancet published in January of this year. And I think it's important to understand that both of these reports were 50 pages long, of very small print. They are very difficult to read. I taught them this year. I had to read them. I forced my poor, unhappy students to read them. And they were plenty unhappy, let me tell you. Reading them was rough going. They were committee reports, typical committee reports, which means that there were many, many inconsistencies throughout the reports. I actually think that the Global Syndemic Report was much more important, and I'll explain why. But basically, both reports were designed to try to figure out how to get the power to prevent food insecurity, promote nutritional health, and protect the environment at the same time. And to do this, the reports, and they had quite a bit of overlap, they obviously talked to each other while they were preparing these reports, the triple duty actions that would do all three at once: prevent food insecurity, prevent obesity and chronic diseases, and protect the environment. They made 4 recommendations. Less red meat. That doesn't mean no red meat. And these recommendations were aimed at resource-rich countries. They do not apply to resource-poor countries. They recommended a largely but not exclusively plant-based diet. They recommended regulation of the food industry, and that's what I thought was so important, and policies that would approach dealing with food problems from a food systems perspective. The Eat Lancet report, which you heard about last night, proposed a planetary health diet, and there are pictures of it here. And what I thought was just amazing about these photographs was that they looked just like the meal that was used as an example of the United States Choose My Plate that came out in 2010. In other words, there was nothing new in this. And even the United States Dietary Guidelines, which are pretty industry influenced, came out with something that could fit just into this. So there was really nothing new or radical about it. It was a little too specific, I think, but not nearly as radical as some have made it seem. But I thought the other report was much more important because it took the food industry on in a way that I've never seen a major scientific research medical journal take it on. It made quite specific recommendations for what to do about food industry practices, end subsidies and tax breaks. In the United States, we give a tax break to corporations for their advertising and marketing. That means that marketing to children of junk foods is subsidized by taxpayers. The companies should pay the externalized costs of their food production. That means cleaning up the Gulf of Mexico and getting the nitrates out of the water supply in Iowa. Companies should be stopped from fighting public health measures. That means that the hundreds of millions of dollars that the food industry has put into fighting soda taxes would be prevented. They should stay out of public policy, a big issue in the UK right now. Disclose conflicts of interest, reveal their political donations, and should be held accountable for the kinds of things that they're doing. Fighting words, and I thought extremely important and well worth reading. But they went beyond that. And they made the statement, and this again is in the Global Syndemic Report, that a transformative social movement is needed to overcome policy inertia. And by policy inertia, they meant the fact that nothing's happening on this. They gave 3 reasons for it. Weak food industry opposition was one of the 3 reasons for policy inertia. The other 2 were weak governments that just aren't strong enough to take action, and weak civil society. Now, I don't think there's a lot that we can do about food industry opposition, and in the United States, at least right now, there's not much we can do about weak governance. But we could do something about weak civil society and try to figure out how to strengthen civil society. Many books have been written about why civil society is weak, but it's time to try to figure out how to turn around that. And I think the civil society issue is important because we are in the middle of a food movement right now. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people everywhere who are really interested in food issues. And the question that we have is, how do we mobilize that interest in order to take power back from the food industry in the food system? The food movement is clearly, although it's fragmented among thousands and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of organizations, these organizations all pretty much are interested in changing the world through a food system that's better for everybody, that protects health and protects the environment and does it all. Okay, the food movement. It's not like the environmental movement, it's not like the civil rights movement, it's not like the women's movement in its enormous fragmentation. And the fragmentation has been criticized as being powerless, and I guess the most eloquent spokesperson for the failure to take power is Michael Pollan, who in the New York Times a few years ago said that whenever the Obamas tried to do anything, they were out-lobbied and outgunned, and the food movement barely exists as a political force. The critique of the food movement is that it has no real power. It's elitist because it's focused on yummy food rather than civic participation and changing the system, and there isn't enough systems changed in it. I think this is too negative. There's grains of truth here, but I think it's way too negative. Looking at what's happening in the United States, on a quantifiable basis, you can count that there are more farmers markets, more organic food, more urban farmers, there's better school food. It may be still bad, but it's better. There are soda taxes in any number of communities. And then my personal favorite is that there are more food studies programs. We started ours at NYU in 1996. And it's just been thrilling to see food studies program one after another open up all over the country and the world for that matter. But I think the food movement is responsible for a great deal more than this. Perhaps not quantifiably. And I'm going to give the food movement credit for our current discussion of food issues in terms of food systems rather than fragmented into agriculture on one side and consumption on the other. I'm going to give the food movement credit for causing the Lancet to give 100 pages of its real estate over to discussions of food system issues. I mean, I think this is an extraordinary achievement. And I'm going to give the food movement credit for encouraging Carlos Montero to define ultra-processed in a very specific way so that it becomes it becomes able to be studied in a scientific way. And you heard a little bit about ultra-processed last night from Johanna. I want to say a little bit more about it because the research is pouring in every day on how important this definition is. For one thing, Montero and his colleagues have defined it, and they've defined it quite specifically to distinguish ultra-processed from processed foods. Ultra-processed foods have no obvious relationship to the foods from which they came. They are loaded with unpronounceable color, flavor, and texture additives. They're not anywhere found in a home kitchen or even a professional kitchen, and they tend to be higher in sugar, salt, and fat than they should be. What is remarkable about this definition of terms is that researchers have been able to go back and look at a great deal of data and sort out in dietary data what the percentage of ultra-processed foods are, and to do studies like this extraordinary study, which is coming out next month, but has already been published in preview form. This was done at the National Institutes of Health in a metabolic ward where people were given controlled diets of either completely ultra-processed foods or completely non-ultra-processed foods. They were allowed to eat as much of them as they wanted over the 2-week period. And what they were able to show in just 2 weeks was that the people who were eating the ultra-processed food diet ate 500 calories a day more than the people who were eating the unprocessed diet, with no other change. They just ate more. That alone is a sufficient explanation for a lot of the metabolic problems that come from eating junk foods. Their body weights increased by a pound, the ones who are eating ultra-processed foods, whereas the ones who are eating unprocessed foods or relatively unprocessed foods lost weight. This kind of research is pouring in. It's beautifully done. It's meticulously done. And it means that the focus on ultra-processed foods is going to be a terrific way to try to do nutrition advising. I'm going to give the food movement credit for what's going on in Latin America in general, and in particular for warning labels on food products in Chile. In Chile, they have been able to pass laws that put these warning labels on, and the particular type of warning label was chosen so that children could understand it. It was focus group tested on children because they wanted children to go to a grocery store and say, don't buy that product, it's got those black things on it. The other thing they were able to do was to pass laws that would get the cartoons off of cereal boxes, so that what you're seeing here is a before and after with that law passed. So I'm giving the food movement credit for that too. I think there's a lot going on. And what we need to do, if we're interested in these kinds of issues and want to see real change in food systems, is to focus on these kinds of things and try to organize civil society to do this. This is democracy in action that we're talking about at a time when democracy is threatened everywhere. No, the food movement can't do everything, but the food movement can do a lot and is doing a lot. And so I'm going to leave you with that. Vote with your vote. Thank you very much.